The low, persistent hum of the refrigerator was the only sound that dared to occupy the space in my apartment, a monotonous drone that had seamlessly woven itself into the background tapestry of my life. But not on that particular night. On that night, it was a mournful dirge, a somber soundtrack to the slow, agonizing bleed-out of my future. I found myself sitting there, bathed in the cold, bluish glow of my three monitors, each one a portal into a world that had, in the span of a few heart-stopping moments, turned on me with the untamed ferocity of a caged beast. My reflection, a hollowed-out and spectral version of the man I was just a few hours prior, stared back at me from the dark, unforgiving screen of the central monitor. The triumphant gleam that had once danced in his eyes, the confident smirk that had become a permanent and arrogant fixture on his face for months, was gone. In its place was a vacant, almost childlike bewilderment, a silent and desperate plea for answers that would never come. How could it all have gone so catastrophically wrong, so dizzyingly fast? It all began, as I suspect many of these tragic tales of modern fortune and folly do, with a seductive whisper of easy money, a siren song of financial freedom that was far too alluring, too intoxicating to ignore. I was a graphic designer, a reasonably good one at that, but the monotonous 9-to-5 grind was a slow-acting and insidious poison, methodically leaching the vibrant color and spontaneity from my life one billable and soul-crushing hour at a time. I would scroll through my social media feeds, a passive observer of a world that seemed to be moving at a different, more exhilarating speed. I would see these kids online, barely out of their teenage years, ostentatiously flashing their newly acquired Lamborghinis and Rolexes, all thanks to a mysterious and enigmatic force called crypto. I was, of course, skeptical at first. It all sounded far too much like a sophisticated and digital-age pyramid scheme, a shimmering and deceptive mirage in the vast and unforgiving desert of the internet. But the whispers, the stories, the legends, they grew louder, more insistent, more difficult to dismiss. Friends of friends were suddenly and inexplicably quitting their jobs, buying houses with cash, and living the kind of sun-drenched, carefree life that I only ever allowed myself to dream of in the quiet, lonely hours of the night. And at the pulsating heart of it all was Bitcoin, the undisputed king, the digital gold, the one that had started this entire revolution. So, with a mixture of trepidation and a burgeoning sense of excitement, I decided to dip my toes into this strange and alluring new world. A few $100s here, 1,000 there. I became a voracious and insatiable consumer of information, watching YouTube tutorials until my eyes burned with a dry, gritty intensity, devouring dense and complex articles on technical analysis, and slowly but surely learning the arcane and cryptic language of candlesticks, moving averages, and Fibonacci retracements. It was like learning a new language, a new way of perceiving and interpreting the world around me. And to my utter and profound surprise, I was good at it. The initial, heart-pounding thrill of my first successful trade was an intoxicating and potent cocktail of adrenaline and validation, a powerful and addictive drug that I couldn't get enough of. I felt as though I had discovered a cheat code for life, a secret and hidden pathway to circumvent the rigid and unforgiving system that had kept me tethered to a desk for so long. The market, with its ebbs and flows, its peaks and valleys, was a living, breathing entity, and I was learning to dance to its complex and unpredictable rhythm. I felt like a maestro conducting a symphony of green and red candles, a master of my own destiny, a financial wizard with the power to conjure wealth from thin air. My initial investment doubled, and then, to my astonishment, it tripled. I began to take bigger, more audacious risks, fueled by a dangerous and volatile cocktail of overconfidence and unchecked greed. The numbers on the screen were no longer just abstract figures. They were a tangible and irrefutable representation of my success, my intelligence, my imminent and glorious escape from the mundane. I was no longer just a graphic designer. I was a trader, a player in the high-stakes, high-reward game of global finance. A subtle but insidious shift began to take place within me. I started to look down on my old life, my old self, with a sense of pity and condescension. The 9-to-5ers, my former peers, were sheep, blindly and obediently following the well-trodden path that had been laid out for them, while I was a wolf, a lone and fearless predator, carving my own path through the dense, unforgiving, and exhilarating jungle of the free market. My days and increasingly my nights became a blur of charts, graphs, and an endless stream of real-time data. I would wake up in the dead of night, my heart pounding in my chest with a frantic and unsettling mixture of fear and excitement, to check the price of Bitcoin. I began to cancel plans with friends, to isolate myself from the outside world, to stay home and watch the market, my once vibrant social life withering away like an untended and forgotten plant. My girlfriend, Sarah, a beacon of love and stability in a life that was becoming increasingly chaotic, tried to pull me back to reality, to the life we had so carefully and lovingly built together. She would plead with me, her voice laced with a growing sense of desperation, to take a break, to cash out some of my profits, to remember the life we had before Bitcoin consumed me whole. But I couldn't hear her. Her voice, once the sweetest and most comforting sound in my world, was just another sound in the background, drowned out by the seductive and all-consuming siren song of the charts. "You don't understand, Sarah," I would say, my eyes glued to the screen, my mind a million miles away in the digital realm of bulls and bears. "This is our future. This is for us." But it wasn't for us. It was for me. It was for my insatiable ego. It was for the gnawing and insatiable hunger for more, for bigger, for faster, that had taken root deep in my soul and was now growing like a malignant and unstoppable cancer. I was on a rocket ship to the moon, and I wasn't about to let anyone, not even the woman I loved more than life itself, pull me back down to the mundane and predictable reality of Earth. The warning signs, the little red flags that dotted the landscape of my new obsession, were there, of course. They were always there. But I chose to ignore them, to dismiss them as the ramblings of the fearful and the uninitiated. The market was becoming more volatile, more unpredictable, more prone to sudden and violent swings. The whispers of a coming crash, a healthy correction, as the crypto evangelists called it, were growing louder, but I dismissed them as FUD, fear, uncertainty, and doubt. The naysayers, the skeptics, the bears, they were just jealous, I told myself. They didn't have the stomach for the game. They didn't have the vision, the courage, the conviction. I was different. I was smarter. I had a system. I had my stop-losses in place, my digital safety nets that would protect me from any sudden and unexpected downturn. I was, in my own deluded and arrogant mind, invincible. Then came the tweet. It was a Tuesday, a day that will forever be seared into my memory with the hot, branding iron of regret. The market was already on edge, teetering on a knife's edge between euphoria and panic. There were rumors swirling, dark and ominous whispers of new regulations, of a government crackdown on exchanges, but I wasn't worried. I had weathered storms before. I had bought the dip, as the saying went, and had come out stronger, richer, and more confident on the other side. I was in a leveraged long position, a big one, a life-changing one. I had bet the farm and then some on Bitcoin breaking through a key resistance level. The profits, if my calculations were correct, would be astronomical, enough to finally and triumphantly quit my job, buy a house with a white picket fence, and live the life that I had been so vividly and obsessively dreaming of. I was so close, so tantalizingly close, that I could almost taste the sweet, intoxicating nectar of victory. I was watching the chart like a hawk, my finger hovering over the mouse, my heart pounding in my chest, ready to take my profits the moment we broke through to the other side. And then, in a single, earth-shattering moment, it happened. A single tweet from the then President of the United States, a random, off-the-cuff, and seemingly innocuous remark about imposing a 100% tariff on all Chinese goods. It was a digital bombshell that sent shockwaves of panic and fear rippling through the global markets. The Dow plunged. The S&P 500 nosedived. And Bitcoin fell off a cliff. It was a waterfall of red, a violent and unrelenting cascade of selling that I had never seen before in all my months of trading. The price was dropping so fast, so precipitously, that the exchange's servers, the very foundation of my digital world, couldn't keep up. My stop-loss, my carefully and strategically placed safety net, my one and only line of defense, didn't trigger. It was a ghost order, a digital promise that had vanished into thin air at the very moment I needed it most. I watched, in a state of stunned and disbelieving silence, as my entire deposit, my entire future, my entire world, was liquidated in a matter of seconds. The numbers on the screen, the ones that had been my pride and my joy, the ones that had come to define my very existence for the past year, were gone. They were replaced by a single, stark, and mocking zero. The hum of the refrigerator was the only sound in the apartment, a low, monotonous, and now deeply mournful drone that was the soundtrack to my ruin. The man in the reflection, the confident and triumphant trader, was gone, replaced by a ghost in the machine. And the machine, the cold and unforgiving machine that I had once believed was my ticket to freedom, had just devoured my soul. The silence that descended upon the room in the immediate aftermath of the final, brutal candle wicked down to zero was more deafening, more oppressive than any scream. It was a void, a vacuum that seemed to suck all the air out of the room, out of my lungs, out of my very being. I just sat there, my hands still hovering over the keyboard and mouse, as if by some sheer force of will I could somehow reverse the irreversible, could will the numbers back into existence. It had to be a glitch, a momentary and catastrophic error on the exchange's part, a temporary blip in the matrix. Any second now, I told myself, a notification would pop up, a sincere and apologetic message for the error, and my funds, my future, would be restored. But the seconds stretched into minutes, and the minutes into what felt like an eternity, and the only thing on the screen was that stark, unforgiving, and soul-crushing zero. The finality of it, the brutal and undeniable reality of it, began to seep into my bones, a chilling and paralyzing realization that this was not a dream, not a simulation, not a nightmare from which I would soon awake. This was real. The money was gone, all of it. The initial seed money, the hard-earned savings that I had so painstakingly accumulated over the years. The profits, the glorious and intoxicating profits that I had so arrogantly and foolishly reinvested, convinced that I was invincible. The funds that I had borrowed from my savings, from my future, even the emergency fund that Sarah and I had so diligently and responsibly built together. It was all gone, vaporized in the digital ether, reduced to nothing more than a ghost of a memory. My mind, which had been so sharp, so focused, so laser-like in its precision just moments before, was now a chaotic and terrifying storm of disbelief and panic. I tried to retrace my steps, to analyze the data, to understand how this could have possibly happened. My stop-loss, it should have triggered. It was a market order, the most basic and fundamental of all safety nets, designed to execute at any price once the stop price was hit. It was the one unbreakable, non-negotiable rule of my trading strategy. Never trade without a stop-loss. And yet it had failed me. Or rather, the exchange, the supposedly reputable and reliable platform that I had entrusted with my entire financial future, had failed me. The sheer and unprecedented volume of sell orders had overwhelmed their system, a flash crash of such epic and devastating proportions that it had left a trail of liquidated accounts, of shattered dreams, in its wake. I was just one of many, a nameless, faceless casualty in a digital war that I didn't even know I was fighting. A wave of intense and debilitating nausea washed over me, and I stumbled to the bathroom, my legs feeling as though they were made of lead, heavy and unresponsive. I reached into the toilet, but nothing came up. Just dry, agonizing heaves that racked my body and left me feeling even more empty and hollowed out than before. I splashed cold water on my face and forced myself to look at my reflection in the mirror. The face that stared back at me was a stranger's. The eyes were wide with a raw and primal terror, the skin pale and clammy, the confident smirk replaced by a look of utter and complete devastation. The confident and successful trader was gone, replaced by a terrified and bewildered child who had just seen a monster. And the monster, I was beginning to realize with a sickening and dawning horror, was me. My own greed, my own arrogance, my own insatiable hubris had led me to this dark and lonely place. I had flown too close to the sun, and my wings, made not of feathers and wax but of digital code and misplaced confidence, had melted, sending me plummeting back down to earth with a bone-shattering and soul-crushing thud. The thought of Sarah was a dagger in my heart, a sharp and searing pain that was almost worse than the financial loss itself. How could I possibly tell her? How could I find the words to explain that our future, the one that I had so confidently and arrogantly promised her, was gone, erased in the blink of an eye? The down payment for the house we had been so excitedly looking at, the trip to Italy that we had been planning for months, the financial security that I had sworn to provide for her. It was all gone, gambled away on a digital coin flip, a high-stakes bet that had gone catastrophically and irrevocably wrong. A sob escaped my lips, a raw, guttural, and unfamiliar sound that I didn't recognize as my own. I slid down the cool, tiled bathroom wall and sat on the floor, my head in my hands, my body shaking with a combination of shock, grief, and self-loathing. The tears came then hot and fast, a torrent of shame and regret that I couldn't control, a flood of emotion that I had been holding back for far too long. I cried for the money, yes, but I cried for so much more. I cried for the person I had become, for the relationships I had neglected, for the trust I had so carelessly and unforgivably broken. I had been so blinded by the flashing lights and the intoxicating promise of easy money that I had lost sight of what truly mattered, of the real and tangible treasures that I already possessed. I don't know how long I sat there on that cold bathroom floor, lost in a sea of self-pity and despair. Eventually, the tears subsided, replaced by a cold, numbing, and terrifying emptiness. I felt hollowed out, a shell of a man, a ghost in my own home. I thought about the online forums, the so-called crypto bros who would be reveling in this crash, the ones who had been calling for a healthy correction, for a cleansing of the market. They would be laughing at people like me, the over-leveraged longs, the retail clowns who had gotten what they deserved. The thought filled me with a white-hot and impotent rage. I wanted to scream, to smash something, to lash out at the faceless, nameless forces that had brought me to my knees. But the anger was fleeting, a brief and unsustainable burst of energy that was quickly replaced by the crushing and inescapable weight of my own stupidity. It wasn't Trump's tweet that had done this to me. It wasn't the whales, the institutional investors, the market manipulators. It was me. I was the one who had taken the risk. I was the one who had ignored the warning signs. I was the one who had put everything, my present, my future, my entire life, on the line for a shot at a life that was never really mine to begin with. The life of a trader, I now realized with a brutal and unforgiving clarity, was a lonely and isolating one. It was a life of constant and unrelenting stress, of sleepless nights, of a perpetual and exhausting state of fight or flight. And for what? For a number on a screen? For the fleeting and ephemeral thrill of a winning trade? I had traded my peace of mind, my relationships, my very soul for a handful of digital dust. And now even that was gone. The hum of the refrigerator, once a comforting and familiar sound of home, was now a mocking and relentless reminder of my failure. It was the sound of an empty fridge, an empty bank account, an empty and desolate life. The night was still young, but for me it felt like the end of the world. And in a way, it was. The world that I had so carefully and arrogantly constructed for myself, the world of a successful and brilliant crypto trader, had come crashing down around me. And I was buried, alive and screaming in the rubble. The confession to Sarah was every bit as brutal, as soul-destroying as I had imagined, and then some. I stumbled through the words, my voice a hoarse and broken whisper, the shame so thick and suffocating in my throat that I could barely speak. I didn't try to make excuses, didn't try to downplay the sheer and catastrophic magnitude of my failure. I laid it all bare, the full, ugly, and unvarnished truth of my addiction, my deception, my catastrophic and life-altering loss. I watched as the initial confusion in her eyes gave way to a dawning and chilling horror, and then to a deep, profound, and heart-wrenching sadness that seemed to extinguish the vibrant and beautiful light within her. There were no tears, not at first. Just a quiet, unnerving, and deeply unsettling stillness that was far more damning, far more accusatory than any outburst of anger or rage would have been. She just sat there, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her gaze fixed on a point somewhere over my shoulder, as if she was looking at a future that had just been mercilessly and irrevocably erased. The silence that followed my confession was a chasm between us, a vast, empty, and unbridgeable space that I didn't know how to cross. I wanted to reach out to her, to hold her, to promise her that I would fix this, that I would make it right, that I would somehow miraculously undo the damage that I had done. But I knew that those were empty words, hollow promises from a man who had already broken so many. The trust, the sacred and unbreakable trust that had been the very foundation of our relationship, had been shattered into a million irreparable pieces, and I didn't know if it could ever be repaired. The days that followed were a living hell, a slow, agonizing, and relentless descent into a new and terrifying reality that was bleaker, colder, and more unforgiving than anything I could have ever imagined. The apartment, once a sanctuary of love, laughter, and shared dreams, was now a cold, silent, and desolate tomb. We moved around each other like ghosts, the unspoken and suffocating tension a constant, oppressive, and palpable presence. Every conversation was strained, every touch hesitant, every look a painful and poignant reminder of what we had lost, of what I had so carelessly and selfishly thrown away. I could see the questions in her eyes, the questions she was too afraid to ask, the questions I was too ashamed to answer. Was I still the man she fell in love with? Or had that man been a fiction, a carefully and deceitfully constructed facade that had now crumbled to dust, revealing the weak, flawed, and broken man beneath? The practicalities of our new and grim situation were a harsh, unforgiving, and relentless reality check. We had to cancel the appointment with the mortgage broker, a call that I made with a heart so heavy it felt like it was going to sink through the floor. We had to put our plans for the future on hold, indefinitely. The trip to Italy, the new car, the simple, everyday luxuries that we had once taken for granted, they were all gone, replaced by a mountain of debt and a future that was shrouded in a thick and impenetrable fog of uncertainty. I went back to my job, my tail tucked firmly between my legs, a ghost of the man who had so arrogantly and foolishly planned on walking away from it all in a blaze of glory. I sat at my desk, surrounded by the mundane and predictable realities of the 9-to-5, and I felt a sense of shame so profound, so all-consuming that it was almost a physical pain. My colleagues, bless their hearts, tried to be supportive, but their well-meaning and clumsy words of encouragement were like salt in an open and festering wound. They didn't understand. They couldn't understand. They hadn't seen what I had seen, hadn't flown as high or fallen as far. They were living in a world of black and white, a world of spreadsheets and deadlines, while I was trapped in a world of gray, a world where the colors had been leached out by the harsh, unforgiving, and relentless light of reality. The nights were the worst. Sleep, once a welcome and restorative escape, was a luxury I could no longer afford. I would lie awake for hours, my mind a relentless and merciless carousel of what-ifs and if-onlys. I would replay the events of that fateful night over and over and over again, searching for a different outcome, a different ending to my story, a path not taken. But there was no other ending. There was only the harsh, unyielding, and inescapable truth of what I had done. The online world, once a source of excitement, camaraderie, and a sense of belonging, was now a place of torment and self-flagellation. I couldn't bring myself to look at the charts, to read the news, to engage with the communities that had once been my home, my tribe. The very sight of a green or red candle was enough to trigger a wave of nausea, a visceral and involuntary reminder of my failure. The crypto world had moved on, of course. The crash, the event that had so utterly and completely destroyed my life, was just a blip on the radar, a distant and forgotten memory for most. The market had recovered, had even reached new and dizzying highs. And the crypto bros, the ones who had reveled in the crash, in the cleansing of the market, were now celebrating their gains, their Lamborghinis and their Rolexes, a testament to a world, to a life, that I was no longer a part of. The bitterness was a poison that I couldn't seem to purge from my system. I was an outsider looking in, a ghost haunting the digital landscape that had once been my kingdom. I had been so close, so tantalizingly and agonizingly close to a life of freedom, a life without limits, a life of my own making. And now I was back where I started, only worse. I was burdened with a debt that would take me years, perhaps even a lifetime, to repay, a broken relationship that I didn't know how to fix, and a sense of self-loathing that was a constant and unwelcome companion. The irony, the cruel and bitter irony of it all was not lost on me. In my desperate and obsessive quest for a life of easy money, I had ended up with no money at all. In my relentless and misguided pursuit of freedom, I had become a prisoner of my own making. The turning point, if you can even call it that, came one evening a few weeks after the crash. Sarah and I were eating dinner in silence, the clinking of our forks against the plates the only sound in the room, a stark and lonely soundtrack to our broken life. I looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time in a long, long time. I saw the dark circles under her eyes, the worry lines etched on her forehead, the spark that had once been so bright, so vibrant, so full of life, now a dull, flickering, and fragile ember. And in that moment something shifted within me. The self-pity, the anger, the bitterness, it all receded, replaced by a wave of empathy so powerful, so overwhelming that it took my breath away. I saw her pain, her fear, her disappointment. And I realized, with a clarity that was both devastating and liberating, that this was not just my story. It was our story. My actions, my selfish and reckless actions, had had consequences not just for me, but for the person I loved most in the world. And I knew in that moment that I had a choice. I could continue to wallow in my own misery, to let this one catastrophic mistake define the rest of my life. Or I could choose to fight. I could choose to rebuild, to atone, to become the man that Sarah deserved, the man I was always meant to be. It wouldn't be easy. It would be a long, arduous, and painful journey, a climb out of a hole so deep, so dark that I couldn't even see the light. But for the first time since the crash, I felt a flicker of hope. It was a small, fragile flame, but it was there. And I knew with a certainty that resonated deep in my soul that I had to protect it, to nurture it, to fan it into a fire that would light the way forward. The road ahead was long and the path uncertain, but I was no longer a traitor. I was a man who had lost everything, and in that loss, in that complete and utter devastation, I had found something that I didn't even know I was searching for. A reason to fight, a reason to hope, a reason to live. And that, I realized, was a currency more valuable than any Bitcoin, any digital gold, any number on a screen. It was the currency of redemption, and it was a currency I was determined to earn. The journey would be long, but for the first time I felt like I was finally on the right path. A path not to the moon, but back to Earth, back to myself, back to the life that I had almost lost. And that, I knew, was a destination worth fighting for.